November 14, 1965, 12:47 p.m., Landing Zone X-ray, South Vietnam. 20-year-old specialist Bill Beck from Pennsylvania couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he gripped his M16 rifle. 3 months of training at Fort Benning hadn't prepared him for this. The Huey helicopter's rotor wash kicked up red dust as it touched down in the elephant grass clearing, and Lieutenant Col Hal Moore's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got company." Beck was one of 450 soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, being inserted into a remote jungle valley 37 miles west of Pleiku. Their mission seemed straightforward: search and destroy, find the enemy, kill them, come home. What Moore's battalion didn't know, what American intelligence had catastrophically underestimated, was that they were landing directly into the assembly area of 3 North Vietnamese Army regiments, over 2,000 regular soldiers who, according to a captured prisoner, wanted very much to kill Americans but have not been able to find any. Within 90 minutes of landing, Beck would be fighting for his life. Within 3 days, the Ia Drang Valley would become synonymous with everything that would define the next 10 years of American warfare in Vietnam. Helicopter assault tactics, overwhelming firepower, questionable kill ratios, and young men, most drafted, many teenagers, thrown into a meat grinder that would consume 58,000 American lives before it ended. This is the story of how American soldiers discovered that courage, technology, and firepower couldn't guarantee victory, that the enemy they faced was willing to absorb casualties that would break any Western army, and that the weapon they'd been issued, the revolutionary M16 rifle, would fail them at the moment they needed it most. Bill Beck hadn't volunteered. None of them had, really. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had an authorized strength of 750 men. Most were draftees, pulled from college classrooms, factory floors, and farm fields by a selective service system that gave deferments to those who could afford college and took those who couldn't. Beck had been studying during the day, working nights at a truck plant in Pennsylvania. Then came the letter, report for induction. Lieutenant Dan Gannon from Iowa understood the math perfectly. "I wanted to serve my country," he later recalled, "but it wasn't in my foremost plans. I was planning on going back to the family farm. Then his brother was shot in Vietnam. It was like, I've got to go over and get those suckers for shooting my brother." The selective service system created an army unlike any America had fielded before. In Lieutenant Colonel Moore's companies, PhD students served alongside men offered the choice between Vietnam or prison. Captain Ramon Tony Nadal, commanding Alpha Company, at age 29, led 95 soldiers. Kids, really, most of whom had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their average age was 19. They trained together at Fort Benning, Georgia, for 14 months. Moore knew his men, trusted his company commanders, believed in his battalion, but training in Georgia's pine forests bore no resemblance to Vietnam's reality. The central Highlands terrain was brutal. Triple canopy jungle, elephant grass taller than a man, temperatures exceeding 100 degrees with humidity that corroded everything metal within days. On November 13, 1965, at 5 p.m., Brigade Commander Colonel Tim Brown dropped into Moore's position by helicopter with new orders. "Hal, you're going into the Ia Drang Valley tomorrow morning. We've got 16 helicopters and your mission is to search for and destroy the enemy. 16 Huey helicopters to move 450 men into the unknown. They would go in light, in waves, 45 minutes between lifts, vulnerable. The Hueys came in low over the clearing designated Landing Zone X-ray at the base of Chu Pong Mountain. Moore was in the first lift with 90 men, a company and his command element. Standard doctrine called for securing the LZ before bringing in the rest of the battalion, but with only 90 men on the ground and the next wave an hour away, they were operating dangerously light in terrain. American intelligence suggested could be filled with a regiment of enemy forces. Journalist Joseph Galloway, who would become the only civilian awarded the Bronze Star for heroism in Vietnam, flew in after dark. "I was very eager to get that ride in," he later said with dark humor. "Through the years I have cursed Bruce Crandall for that ride in and thanked him for the ride out." Moore's premonitions proved horrifyingly accurate. During the first hour, his troops captured an enemy prisoner, a boy, terrified, who revealed that 2 Pavan regiments on the mountain wanted very much to kill Americans but have not been able to find any. There were actually 3 regiments, the 32nd, 33rd, and 66th, over 4,000 soldiers total, veterans of fights against the French, now eager to test themselves against the Americans. At that moment, Moore knew survival had replaced offense as his mission. Roughly 90 minutes after landing, the jungle erupted. Captain Nadal's Alpha Company was probing toward the mountain when the tree line ahead exploded with AK-47 fire. Within seconds, one of his platoons was cut off, surrounded by North Vietnamese soldiers executing the tactic they would perfect over the next decade, hugging the Americans, fighting so close that devastating American artillery and air support couldn't be called without killing their own men. "I heard deafening fire going off," Nadal recalled. "I got a call from Col Moore telling us to find that platoon and bring them back. My soldiers had seen their buddies killed. We've got a platoon out there," I told them, "and we're gonna go get them." What followed was combat at ranges so close that soldiers fought with bayonets, 45 pistols, and fists. "One of my sergeants killed a North Vietnamese soldier with his bayonet," Nadal remembered. "Another killed one with his 45. One of my lieutenants wore a compass. I saw it explode on his chest." Galloway, hugging the dirt behind a termite mound, as rounds snapped overhead, felt a boot thump his ribs. It belonged to Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, a bear of a West Virginia man who leaned over and shouted above the gunfire, "Can't take no pictures laying there on the ground, sonny." Galloway thought, sergeants major are always right. Then it struck him. He was with the 7th Cavalry, Custer's regiment, in a river valley, surrounded by an overwhelmingly superior enemy force. History was repeating itself 90 years later. As darkness fell on November 14th, Beck and his company dug in for the night. The North Vietnamese probed constantly, small groups testing the perimeter, looking for weak points, keeping the Americans awake and burning ammunition. By dawn on the 15th, the 66th Regiment joined the assault. 2,000 fresh North Vietnamese soldiers hit the American positions in human waves. It was during this attack that American soldiers discovered their M16 rifles were killing them. The M16 had arrived in Vietnam in early 1965 with extraordinary promises, weighing half as much as the M14 it replaced, firing a smaller 5.5 M6 round that allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. It was supposed to be the weapon that would give Americans technological superiority over the enemy's AK-47s. The rifle had been touted as so advanced, so reliable, that it was self-cleaning. Soldiers didn't even need cleaning kits. It was a lie that would cost hundreds of lives. "Out of 40 rounds I've fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times, wrote one Marine to his parents, desperation bleeding through every word. "I pack as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar, so I'll have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a paintbrush. I need it. Our rifles are getting a lot of guys killed because they jam so easily." The catastrophic failure had multiple causes, each a bureaucratic decision made thousands of miles from the jungle. The rifle's chamber wasn't chrome-plated, allowing Vietnam's humidity to corrode the barrel. The ammunition issued with the M16 used ball powder instead of the stick powder the rifle had been designed for. It burned dirtier, fouling the chamber after a few magazines. Soldiers received no cleaning kits, no instructions on maintenance, because the rifle was supposed to maintain itself. In combat, M16s experienced failure to extract, spent brass casings stuck in the chamber, rendering the rifle as effective as a single-shot musket. The only solution was to push a cleaning rod down the barrel to knock out the stuck case. Try doing that while North Vietnamese soldiers charge your position. "We called it the Mattel 16 because it was made of plastic," recalled Marine veteran Jim Wadecki. "At that time, it was a piece of garbage. If it got any grime or dirt in it, which you always get in the field, it's going to malfunction. At Ia Drang, soldiers wrote home begging for weapon lubricant, cleaning patches, brushes, and bore rods, basic supplies that should have been issued with the rifle. Some wrote their congressman. The letters were a living chronicle of betrayal. Young men sent to fight with defective weapons because bureaucrats and defense contractors had prioritized cost over lives. The worst part, many soldiers began picking up enemy AK-47s, weapons that worked when dropped in mud, submerged in water, or left uncleaned for weeks. An underground market developed among American troops trading for captured AK-47s. They trusted the enemy's rifle more than their own. For 3 days and 2 nights, Moore's battalion held landing zone X-ray against repeated assaults. Major Bruce Crandall, flying a Huey helicopter, made 22 flights into the LZ under intense fire, evacuating 70 wounded and delivering ammunition. Every approach brought him through walls of tracer fire. On one flight, 3 soldiers on his helicopter were killed and 3 wounded before he even landed. Crandall kept his bird on the ground in direct enemy fire to load 4 more wounded. Captain Ed Freeman flew repeatedly into the valley to bring supplies and evacuate wounded, his helicopter taking hits on nearly every approach. Both men would eventually receive the Medal of Honor, though it took decades for Freeman's award to be approved. The artillery support was devastating. Throughout the battle, American guns fired over 33,000 rounds into the valley. B-52 bombers, used for the first time in tactical support, dropped hundreds of tons of high explosive on the surrounding mountains. The ground shook, the jungle burned, the North Vietnamese kept coming. By November 16th, 2 more air cavalry battalions had been flown in. The North Vietnamese began withdrawing, carrying their wounded, dragging their dead, melting back into Cambodia, where American forces couldn't follow. They left 634 confirmed bodies around X-ray. American estimates claimed over 1,800 North Vietnamese killed. The reality was unknowable. American casualties, 79 killed, 121 wounded at X-ray. But the battle wasn't over. On November 17th, 1965, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, Moore's sister battalion, marched overland to landing zone Albany, several miles north. They moved in a long column through elephant grass, spread out over a quarter-mile along a narrow trail. At 1:30 p.m., they walked into an ambush. The North Vietnamese had positioned 1,100 soldiers along the column's route. When they opened fire, the American formation disintegrated. Soldiers found themselves in hand-to-hand combat, fighting enemies they could barely see in the tall grass. In the distance, I could see North Vietnamese soldiers in their khaki uniforms advancing with their AK-47s blazing, remembered one survivor. Soon, there was the cry, "Medic!" from the wounded. What started as a walk in the sun had suddenly turned into a hellish nightmare as friends of mine were dropping everywhere. I can recall flipping the safety off on my M16 and firing quick bursts at the North Vietnamese advancing on our position. 1, 2, 3 dropped, yet they still kept coming. I fumbled with another magazine, hands shaking. I could see the sun glistening off their bayonets as they pushed forward. The battle at Albany lasted into the evening. Of 375 men in the 2nd Battalion, 155 were killed and 135 wounded, over 75% casualties. Company C suffered 93% casualties, half of them dead. It was the highest single-day loss of American life in Vietnam to that point. The North Vietnamese lost an estimated 403 soldiers at Albany. They considered it a victory, not because they'd taken ground or destroyed American units, but because they'd learned they could fight the Americans and survive. General Vo Nguyen Giap, commanding North Vietnamese forces, drew the crucial lesson: avoid large conventional battles, fight at close range where American firepower couldn't be used, control the tempo, and accept casualties that would horrify any Western army. "Don't worry," North Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh told his commanders after Ia Drang. "I've been to America. I know Americans. They will grow tired and go home." In the White House Rose Garden on August 19, 1967, President Lyndon Johnson awarded the 1st Cavalry Division the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions at Ia Drang. He praised them for completely defeating the numerically superior enemy. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, was pleased with the better than 10-to-1 kill ratio. It seemed to prove that American firepower could win a war of attrition. They were both wrong. The North Vietnamese had learned they could absorb the casualties. They had learned to fight at hugging distance, where American artillery and air power couldn't reach them without killing Americans. Most importantly, they had learned that Americans measured success in body counts, a metric they could manipulate by simply carrying away their dead. For the American soldiers who survived Ia Drang, the lessons were different and darker. They learned that courage wasn't enough, that superior firepower couldn't compensate for an enemy willing to die, that their own rifles would fail them when they needed them most. Mike Troyer, a squad leader in Delta Company who had arrived in Vietnam just 3 months before Ia Drang, wrote home with bitter clarity, "This war is run by the book, and Charlie can't read English, so he gets all the breaks, and we usually get killed. I don't feel like marching in any protest march against Vietnam, but this war is worthless." The M16 controversy finally reached critical mass in March 1967, when the Washington Daily News broke the story of soldiers dying because their rifles jammed. A congressional investigation followed. The Army was forced to chrome plate the chamber, modify the rifle to work with ball powder ammunition, and issue cleaning kits, all modifications that should have been done before the rifle ever reached Vietnam. The improved M16A1 began reaching troops in late 1967. By then, thousands of Americans had already died. How many because of rifle malfunctions? The Army never calculated that number. It didn't want to know. Bill Beck came into Ia Drang with 95 men in his company. 18 were killed and 26 wounded in 2 days of fighting. He survived with his rifle, his courage, and the absolute commitment to the men on his left and right. "You become extremely close in a combat environment," remembered Lieutenant Gannon, "closer than you would to your own family because it's life and death." When Beck finally rotated home in 1966, he faced a reality that veterans of World War II hadn't experienced: contempt. Anti-war protests had exploded across America. Returning soldiers were called baby killers, spat upon, their service ignored or condemned. Unlike previous wars where soldiers came home together on troop ships, processing their experiences together, Vietnam veterans returned individually, 1 day in the jungle, 2 days later walking the streets of San Francisco, trying to explain to civilians who didn't want to hear. Mike Troyer was lucky. He survived until his date eligible for return from overseas. Before leaving Vietnam, he did one thing that captured the alienation every returning veteran felt. He sent a self-addressed letter home, welcoming himself back to civilian life. He knew no one else would. The 2.7 million Americans who served in Vietnam each had unique experiences, shaped by where they served, when they arrived, and pure chance. Some never saw combat. Others, like the men of the 7th Cavalry at Ia Drang, experienced the worst combat of the war in their first months in country. What united them was the feeling that their country had sent them to fight a war it didn't understand, with weapons that didn't work for objectives that didn't matter. And when they came home, that same country turned away. By the time the last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973, the statistics told a story of enormous sacrifice for ambiguous results. 58,220 Americans killed, 304,000 wounded. Average age of American combat soldiers, 19 years old. Percentage drafted, approximately 25% of total forces, but much higher percentage in combat units. North Vietnamese casualties, by their own admission, 600,000 killed between 1965-1968 alone. The kill ratio that so pleased General Westmoreland was real. American firepower did kill enemy soldiers at rates of 10 to 1 or better, but it didn't matter. The North Vietnamese had a larger population, lower casualty sensitivity, and unlimited backing from China and the Soviet Union. They could replace losses. America couldn't stomach the political cost. More than 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers died during the war. They kept fighting. 58,000 Americans died. America demanded withdrawal. In 1994, Lieutenant Col Hal Moore, by then retired as a lieutenant general, traveled back to the Ia Drang Valley with journalist Joe Galloway and veterans from both sides of the battle. The journey took a year to arrange. The U.S. still didn't have diplomatic relations with Vietnam. They walked the ground where they had fought. American veterans met North Vietnamese veterans who had tried to kill them 29 years earlier. They shared stories, compared experiences, and acknowledged the courage both sides had shown. "I came in with 95 guys," Captain Nadal remembered. 18 were killed, and another 26 were wounded in 2 days. He paused. The respect and love we had for each other as brothers in arms, is for life. I don't have words to explain. We were just brothers. A North Vietnamese veteran who had fought at LZ X-ray spoke through an interpreter. We wanted to kill Americans. That was our mission. But when we found your wounded, many times we left them alone. There was respect. You fought well. The Battle of Ia Drang became synonymous with American courage under fire, with the potential and limitations of helicopter warfare, and with the harsh mathematics of a war of attrition. The story was told in the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young by Moore and Galloway, later adapted into a film starring Mel Gibson. But the real story of Ia Drang isn't about tactics or kill ratios. It's about young Americans, most of them teenagers, many drafted against their will, who did their duty even when their rifles failed, even when the strategy was flawed, even when they knew the war was, as Mike Troyer wrote, worthless. They fought for each other, for the man on their left and right, for survival. And when they came home, they carried invisible wounds that would haunt them for decades. The flashbacks, the nightmares, the guilt of surviving when friends died, the questions that had no good answers. At a veterans' reunion decades after the war, former adversaries shared a moment of uncomfortable truth. An American veteran asked a North Vietnamese officer, "What did you think when you first saw us landing in helicopters with all our firepower and technology?" The Vietnamese officer considered the question carefully before answering through an interpreter. "We thought you were very impressive, very frightening, but we also knew something you didn't." "What was that?" "We knew we would never leave. This was our home. You would eventually go back to yours. We only had to survive long enough for you to leave. That knowledge made all your power less important." It was the simple truth that 3 American presidents, dozens of generals, and 58,220 dead Americans couldn't overcome. The Ia Drang Valley taught both sides lessons about the war to come. The North Vietnamese learned they could fight the Americans and survive. The Americans learned they could win every battle and still lose the war. Bill Beck and Mike Troyer and Lieutenant Gannon and Captain Nadal did everything their country asked of them. They fought with defective rifles in impossible conditions against an enemy that wouldn't quit. They came home changed, many broken, most unwelcomed. Their story is worth remembering not because they won or lost, but because they showed up. Because when their rifles jammed in the middle of firefights, they grabbed grenades and bayonets and kept fighting. Because when their friends fell wounded, they ran through gunfire to pull them back. Because they were 19 years old and terrified and brave beyond measure. The Ia Drang Valley was America's first major battle in Vietnam. The patterns established there, helicopter assaults, artillery support, body counts, close quarters combat, and soldiers betrayed by their equipment, would repeat for the next 8 years. And when it was finally over, when the last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in Saigon in 1975, America would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Courage alone doesn't win wars, neither does firepower, neither does sacrifice. Sometimes the valley you enter is one you can never truly leave.